Well, now I'm joined by the man who famously coined the term the end of history when, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the world looked forward and saw liberal democracy with the free market at its side as the goal of almost all societies. Fascism and communism had come and gone from being major global ideologies. Only liberal democracy still stood. And really, until a couple of years ago, that thesis looked set to hold. And then we had Trump and we have Brexit, and suddenly all we know about the world order seemed to be under threat. Suddenly, strongmen leaders are rising across the globe, carried by extremism and populism and a growing army of supporters. Well, the man who coined the phrase the end of history is Francis Fukuyama, a professor at Stanford's Institute for International Studies and formerly a researcher at the Rand Corporation. And he's recently published a book called Identity, and in that he delves into how identity politics now threatens the democratic systems that we've so long taken as the norm. Francis Fukuyama joins me. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Let's talk about a definition of identity politics. What do you mean?
Sure. So identity politics arises from a feeling that I think is universal in human beings, that we have a certain inner dignity and we want other people to recognize it. We want them to respect us as a human being or for particular qualities we feel we have. There's a modern version of identity in which that inner self is given a supreme value over all of the surrounding social rules. And so, in a way, the Me Too movement is a perfect example of that women believe they have an inner, women do have an inner source of dignity that is related to their whole person, but men are treating them simply as sexual objects. And under the modern version, it's really the men that have to give way. It's the surrounding society that needs to change and to recognize that inner dignity. And I think that a lot of our politics has taken that form. What really troubles me about the contemporary world is that there's a right-wing version now of identity politics that's arisen, that's reflected, I think, in the votes for Brexit and for Donald Trump. In other parts of the world, in Eastern Europe, it's come on very strong, and I think that is really threatening many aspects, not of democracy, but of liberal democracy. It's really threatening the constitutional order in many countries.
People who are supporters of Trump, and the people who felt that they had been overlooked by previous administrations when we saw the outsourcing of jobs to the Far East, and they were left feeling completely irrelevant. They might say, well, we have our identity too. You know, Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a movement that started maybe in the 1960s. The Me Too movement is much more recently evolving, and there are other movements as well. But they would say, what's wrong with White Lives Matter?
Well, I think it really depends on the intention of the speaker. I mean, there's a certain group of white people that are racist and xenophobic, and they simply don't like the fact that their society has people that aren't like them. I do think, however, that there's been a particular problem among many ordinary, not particularly racist or xenophobic white voters that are working class or have jobs that have been outsourced. If you lose a job, it's not simply a loss of income. It's also a loss of social status and respect, because basically unemployment means your society doesn't think you're doing anything particularly valuable. And there's been, millions of people put in this situation by the kind of globalization that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years. And I think it's that dispossession and their feeling that they're not being respected by the elites in the media, in politics, that has driven a politics of resentment that then, leads to the kind of populism we've seen.
The notion of national identity, I mean, in Poland, for example, there is a right-wing burgeoning force. And yet, the most recent economic data from Poland suggests it's a country doing really well.
Well, this is why I think people misunderstand the sources of populism. It may be triggered, in a sense, by deindustrialization and globalization, but it actually rests on this cultural basis where people that actually are doing well are the ones that are leading the charge. And Poland is a prime example of that. I think you see that also in the Brexit vote, where many Leave voters we're told by the elites that it's going to cost you a lot of, income when companies start moving out of Britain. And a lot of their responses, well, that's okay, as long as it reduces the number of foreigners coming into the country and the kind of cultural shift that we're seeing, I would accept that loss. And so that's why economics does not always trump these kinds of cultural considerations.
Has there been a mistake made by policymakers which wants to allow people to come in, refugees and so on, and in the most recent wave, I suppose, from Syria, but they're coming from all over the globe to different parts of the developed world, which says, yes, come in. But unlike the melting pot of the United States, where everyone ultimately wanted to be American and as quickly American as possible, some policymakers are saying, no, if you're Afghan, you can retain your Afghan identity and you can make us change to accommodate you.
Well, I think that's a wrong interpretation of multiculturalism. I think that you cannot really have a successful democratic society unless people agree on certain common shared values about the legitimacy of their institutions, about the way they treat individuals in their society. So, for example, if that Afghan refugee family forces their daughters to marry somebody back in Afghanistan or otherwise restricts her freedom, that's a contradiction of a very basic value in a liberal democracy, which is that all people, including all women, have agency over their own lives. And so I do think that our societies actually are based on a individualistic interpretation of what it means to be free, and not a cultural one in which equality means, well, we have to regard all cultures as equal and equally tolerated.
Are the French getting it right?
Well,
I mean, they got it wrong, we know, by the creation of ghettos in Saint-Denis outside Paris and all of that, and in cities like Marseille to the south and other places which have been, some would say, taken over by North African immigrants.
Yes,
but
well,
they're changing
part
policy.
of it right.
Yeah.
They got part of it right. So in terms of national identity, unlike their neighbor Germany or a number of other continental European countries, they have always been much more willing to give citizenship to people that were not white or not ethnically, the traditional French. Their citizenship was based on the principles of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. I think the problem in France is that their economy has been very sluggish. It hasn't generated jobs and opportunities for young people in general, but especially young people from immigrant communities. And I do think that they also suffer a little bit from this this form of the wrong interpretation of multiculturalism I was talking about, where, the left has protected the cultural autonomy of these migrant communities rather than stressing, the need for them to integrate into this kind of broader French Republican culture.
Sometimes it's easier. There was a time when no blacks or Irish need apply in Britain. The Irish have absolutely assimilated and have become central players in every aspect of British life, be it broadcasting, media, industry, and so on and so forth. But perhaps, and yet remain Irish and staunchly Irish and proclaim their Irishness. But perhaps because they look like the majority of the British, it makes it easier.
Well, certainly that racial element is something that makes assimilation easier. But I do think that, in a way, the essence of what it means to be British right now has gravitated away from ethnicity, towards a set of political values that you try to absorb when you become a naturalized British citizen. And in that respect, I don't think the Irish, are really different. They don't espouse a set of anti-democratic political values such that, they would have a separate, form of government. The Irish Republic, as far as I can tell, is a really good democracy. And therefore, there's a fundamental alignment of those political values, which means that I think integration, for anyone from Ireland becomes much, a much simpler process.
Is there any way this genie of identity politics can be stuffed back in the bottle, or is it almost a cyclical thing? I mean, we saw the nationalism of Germany and of Italy under their dictators, and we can pick other examples from around Europe, whether it's in the Balkans or anywhere else. Is it going to be cyclical? Will something change? Prosperity, a crisis, something that will change the way we view things?
You know, I honestly think that a lot of this is a matter of political leadership, that you can have leaders that either emphasize grievance and resentment and exacerbate these conflicts between different identity groups. I mean, that's almost the definition of Donald Trump. Ever since he became president, he seems to get up every morning and think, how can I actually make people more resentful and more angry? Or you can be like an Emmanuel Macron. You can be a leader with a broader, more cosmopolitan vision of what you want your country to be. And in particular, I think that, we need more leaders in the democratic West that stress things like a liberal, open sense of patriotism or national identity, not the kind of patriotism that leads to aggression and external conflict. You need one that actually stresses democratic values and inclusion, but it has to be some set of ideas that allow people to believe that they're actually part of the same democratic community. I think that is entirely possible. And unfortunately, the most brilliant politicians lately have been ones that have exploited exactly the opposite sentiment.
I remember being in Moscow in the era of glasnost and perestroika, and the first McDonald's opened in Moscow. And it was very interesting because on one side, you could walk in without queuing and pay with dollars and get your Big Mac very quickly. On the other side, you paid in rubles, which were worth nothing, but it made the burger very cheap. But you queued around the block to get your McDonald's. The two arches theory, which was, I think, advocated by Thomas Friedman a couple of decades ago, was that this is the golden arches doctrine, that no two countries with the McDonald's would ever go to war. And then we had Russia v. Georgia, and more recently Russia v. Ukraine, which demolished the Golden Arches theory.
Right. Well, that was never an accepted social science theory, I'm afraid. I think that, in a way, it's more the liberalism than the democracy. I mean, you actually have democracies that have fought wars, India and Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan's been a very imperfect democracy, but they've still been democracy at certain periods, and that hasn't prevented a huge amount of hostility. I think the more important thing is the liberal part of liberal democracy. That means abiding by a constitution that limits the power of the executive. It means the rule of law, respect for individual rights. And I think if you have countries that genuinely follow a rule of law, it is probably less likely that they will go to war. And it turns out that the countries that are that way tend to be richer ones. So I think that's the only sense in which that Golden Arches theory could hold.
Well, your current book is called Identity, Contemporary Identity Politics and the Struggle for Recognition. It's published by Profile Books. It's available now for about €20. And Francis Fukuyama, professor at Stanford's Institute for International Studies and author of Identity, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I didn't come here really to speak, but to listen. I think that what's happening in Ukraine is a model and an inspiration for nationalists of all white nations, and I wanted to learn as much as possible about what you're doing here and see as much as possible. And I'm enormously impressed. I've been taking notes. And I guess to pay my way, though, I'm going to share some of my ideas with you. I have a few copies of this book, The White Nationalist Manifesto, if any of you are interested in that. It has sold remarkably well. It's been out for a month today. It came out on the 15th of September. And when I was following its rise and fall on the bestseller lists at Amazon.com, it was actually number 2 in the political philosophy listing twice, and the number 1 book was by Francis Fukuyama called Identity. And I'm not flattering myself to think that Fukuyama is going to read my book, but I did get a copy of his and I read it. I've been following Fukuyama since 1992, actually since 1989, when he first came on the scene with his essay about the end of history and raising the question, is the fall of communism in Eastern Europe the end of history that was prophesied by Hegel? And in 1992, he published a book called The End of History and the Last Man, which expanded that thesis. So, well, I should say one thing about what I've seen here in Ukraine. You're doing metapolitics, right? Not only are you serious about ideas, you're serious about community building. And I see that you are actually building an alternative social order here, an alternative society, and that's what we all need to be doing in all white countries. We have to have some kind of organizational nucleus that can demonstrate that it can do all the things necessary to secure a society's future, because that will give us the ability to actually take power someday and do that. And I think that process is most far along in this country, and that's what's really impressive to me. Now, everybody has a plan A and a plan B. The plan A for American white nationalists like me is to save America as a white nation. And plan B, if that can't be done, is to at least prevent America from interfering with Europe's attempts to save itself, and countries like Ukraine and their attempts to save themselves, countries like Hungary, the healthy parts of Europe. Now, the enemy has a plan A and a plan B too. And plan A was basically what we've been seeing in Western Europe and the United States. It's to promote selfish individualism, low birth rates, shattered families, prolonged adolescence, and open the borders to race replacement levels of immigration from the third world. And the net result of that, if applied long enough, would be the simple extinction of white people. That was plan A. But plan A had some unintended consequences. It created a reaction. We're the reaction to plan A. And because of the reaction to plan A, the establishment has been formulating plan B. And plan B is being formulated by people like Francis Fukuyama and other people who are in the United States known as neoconservatives. And what plan B is a way of preserving the existing power structure in America and the West, to preserve it against the rise of white identity politics, to preserve it against the rise of nationalism and populism, by promoting a somewhat more conservative and somewhat more inclusive form of civic nationalism. And that's really what the agenda of Fukuyama's book Identity is. It's to keep the existing establishment in power by putting on the brakes slightly, by slowing the process down slightly, because they realize that if the establishment keeps its foot on the brakes, keeps pushing multiculturalism and open borders, that there is going to be a reaction, and that reaction might sweep them out of power. The opening sentence of Fukuyama's book is basically, this book never would have been written if Donald Trump had not been elected president of the United States. That was a wake-up call. That was a scary thing. Brexit happened. I remember when Brexit happened, my mother was in Europe, and she was talking to some typical liberal English woman. They were in Denmark, actually. And this woman was just shocked, and she said, if Brexit can happen, Trump can get elected. And if Trump can get elected, Le Pen can get elected. That was the panic. That was the fear. Brexit happening made it possible, made it conceivable for Trump, and made a lot of other things conceivable. And once Trump got elected, that made a lot of other things conceivable. And people like Fukuyama and others started peering into the abyss, and they saw the rise of white identity politics. Behind Trumpian civic nationalism, they spied white identity politics, and they were wise to do that because we were there, boosting Trump, the alt-right, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them, were his most effective online defenders and cheerleaders. And they got afraid, and they were right to be afraid. You know, today is actually Nietzsche's birthday. And Nietzsche had this famous phrase, you know, you stare long enough into the abyss and the abyss might start staring back at you. Well, they have stared into the abyss and they see us. And so my little talk about Fukuyama is the abyss staring back and reading Fukuyama and analyzing him. So Fukuyama in this book concedes an enormous number of points to us. It's really quite remarkable. I started writing a list of it, and I'll just share you a list of some of the things he concedes to us. He says the basis of nationalist identity politics is in human nature and it cannot be abolished. He talks about how on Plato's account of the human soul, there are three parts of a soul. In the middle part of the soul, you people in Plowman are reading about this now, right, or the Republic. The middle part of the soul is called thumos, or spiritedness. And really what it means is love of one's own, attachment to one's own. But it's also caught up with one's sense of honor. And that is a real part of the human psyche, according to Fukuyama. It means that mankind is not just a rational producer-consumer, which is what liberalism presupposes about us. And that means that there is a foundation in human nature of identity politics, and specifically of nationalist identity politics, attachment to a group of one's own, one's people. He also concedes that leftist identity politics, and especially the more far-out kind of intersectional identity politics that we hear about today, is based on a phony Protestant/liberal misunderstanding of the self, of the inner nature of the self. It's this idea that there is this inner self that we all have, which is good, and that must be recognized by society, and no society is legitimate, no institution is legitimate, no law is legitimate, unless this inner self can give its authorization or consent to it. That's basically the psychology that gives us liberalism, and it's also the psychology that gives us all this whining, mewling, identity politics of people who want to decide, who want 56 genders to choose from on Facebook or whatever. It's Tumblrite identity politics, basically. It's hyper-subjectivist identity politics of neurotic people who think that they can choose their identity. And then if they feel these deep feelings of alienation, then society has to recognize them and coddle them and make them feel at home. He concedes that this is just based on rubbish and rot, that it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what human nature is. But it's plausible enough that it can create a constituency that wants that. Unfortunately, the constituency that wants that liberal left identity politics wants something that can never satisfy them. These people are miserable because they are free. Okay, and liberalism basically makes people miserable because it demands a kind of freedom that they're not really satisfied by. That's an extraordinary concession that he makes. He says that liberalism, individualism, and democracy, the whole modernization process, understood as basically liberating this inner self from any kind of external constraints, actually undermines the cultural conditions that make life meaningful. It creates nihilism, and it gives rise to a healthy desire to restore social meaning. It gives rise to reactionary politics, reactionary nationalism, an attempt to restore the authority of shared ways of life and shared understandings of meaning. That's an extraordinary thing for a centrist who was proclaiming that liberal democracy is the end of history to concede. He talks about how the left has betrayed and abandoned the workers of white nations for refugees, non-whites, sexual misfits, feminists, and so forth. And that has been the major force in the rise of right-wing populism, white identity politics. That's an enormous concession. He says that diversity within the same state gives rise to conflict and disorder. The only positive things he can say about diversity basically reduces to a wider variety of food, ethnic food. That's about the only non-vacuous thing he can say in favor of diversity. That is the last refuge of liberals calling for diversity. And guess what? We can take the recipes and send them home. They don't have to live amongst us. We can make our own damn burritos. It doesn't require a large colony of people from Mexico to do it. He argues that having a unified national culture promotes many very centrally important goods, political goods. It promotes good government itself. Again, that's extraordinary for anybody to concede today. He says that identity politics on the left weakens the left and strengthens the right. He says that a creedal idea of civic nationalism, where you just hold on to a few basic principles, like believing as Americans do or supposed to do, that all men are created equal, that something like that is not sufficient to maintain any society, even a liberal democratic society, that one needs a common culture that's authoritative and that people are irrationally identified with. That's kind of an amazing thing. And he also says something that totally blew my mind, and I had to reread it 3 times to make sure that I wasn't reading something into it. But he said, one can actually establish national identity by moving borders to fit peoples, and moving peoples to fit borders. That's practically the way I talk about it in this manifesto. And he says it can be done in a completely peaceful manner. So he concedes a whole lot of premises that I use in this book to argue for white nationalism. So what is his alternative to it? He's really conceded almost everything that we need. So how is he going to pull back from the abyss? Pull back from, we're the abyss, right? Nationalism, restored European ethnic nationalism is what he wants to avoid. How is he going to avoid that? Well, his agenda in the book is very simple. It's very clear that the entire agenda of this book is to fend off white identity politics. He wrote an entire book to stop our kind of politics from rising any further. And that's flattering because he's a very, very prominent intellectual. And he's not the only one. There's been a whole spate of books in the last year that are dedicated to the same thing. A lot of them also by neoconservatives, it turns out. Mark Lilla has a book called A Once and Future Liberal. William Galston, another neocon, has a book called Anti-Pluralism, The Threat to Liberal Democracy. There's a Polish Jew named Yasha Munk, who has a book with the funniest title of last year, which is The People versus Democracy, The Threat of Populism, right? And on and on. I have a small shelf now filled with these books, just in English. And for a while, the left simply thought they could sneer at us and mock us in sort of middle-brow discourse on sites like Salon.com and Gawker. They thought that was sufficient. Then they started trying to ignore us, and then the alt-right happened, and then they got panicked. And finally they started putting some of their A-team people, some genuinely intelligent people, some real intellectuals, not just journalists, right? Real intellectuals were basically tasked with the project of destroying our ideas. And Fukuyama is one of the most prominent of these intellectuals, one of the most celebrated ones. He's also very concerned to figure out a way to further entrench multicultural, multiracial, liberal democracy in white nations. That's his goal. And his method and his proposals are basically as follows. First of all, because left-wing anti-white identity politics is driving the rise of pro-white right-wing identity politics, the left has to be convinced to return to an earlier incarnation of the left, in which it was battling for greater economic opportunity and equality, when basically white workers mattered more than transsexuals. There was a time when the left actually was battling for the interests of white people, the white working class, the white rural class. And it achieved a lot of positive changes in Western societies. It achieved social safety nets. The labor movement was extremely important. There were many concrete, enormously beneficial things that the left did by striving for greater equality. They've stopped doing that, though, and Fukuyama, oddly enough, because all of his economic views are complete neoliberal nonsense, right? He's all for free trade against protectionism and everything else. He believes all the stuff that's given rise to the present-day oligarchy. And yet, he goes through this book and he laments, or pretends to lament, how the left has abandoned the white working class. Obviously, I don't think he wants communism. He doesn't want the left as it used to be. But what he does want to do is persuade leftists to cool it with the identity politics, right? Think about the workers. The left has alienated the white working class and driven the white working class towards populists in the United States and in Europe. And he's concerned to get the left to change their course. So that's part of his strategy. He also says that we need to strengthen national identities in diverse liberal democracies. And his recommendations are extremely weak. Basically, he says there are 4 ways of making national identities. You can move peoples, so you can have a homogeneous society with one people in one state. You can move borders to do the same thing. That's what ethno-nationalists have to consider. That's what I think is the necessary thing. We have to, and then he says, or we can assimilate new people, and we can also create new forms of identity that are inclusive, so that these multicultural societies can somehow feel that they are one. And the recommendations, though, the concrete recommendations that he makes are shockingly weak. So, for instance, he talks about what the EU should do. He said the EU failed to, the EU has failed because it did not create a common European citizenship, common European education and civic values, and a democratically responsive governing set of governing institutions. And he's very specific about certain countries that he thinks are especially bad in the EU. He thinks France is terrible because France has strong labor unions, and that means high unemployment for black people and brown people in the ghettos. He wants Macron, basically, to break the French labor movement and to lower French wages so that more Arabs and blacks can have jobs. He thinks that's the key to better integration in France and creating a one nation in France, a greater assimilation in France. He says that in the Netherlands, this old tradition of supporting the state supporting separate religious schools for different denominations, which now includes Muslims, has failed in assimilating Muslims, and therefore that there needs to be one common education for all students in the Netherlands. He talks about how all the European societies that have citizenship based on descent need to get rid of that law, the jus sanguinis law, the idea of the law of blood, and replace it with civic notions, jus soli, meaning if you're born on this territory, you're a citizen. And of course, that's also connected with basically civic notions of identity and citizenship, where you can swear an oath and become a citizen. He talks about all these sweeping reforms of the EU and doesn't mention one thing that would be absolutely necessary for these things to happen, namely for the 28 member states of the European Union to lose their sovereignty entirely to the center. And I'm afraid that they're probably all 28 of those states, if you were to put that choice to them in the vulgar way that Fukuyama offers, would say, no, we veto that. So it's offering basically a pipe dream. The only way that he thinks that Europe can assimilate all these Asians, East, South Asians, Arabs, blacks, and so forth, is by basically destroying the remnants of European sovereignty and imposing a homogenizing education on Europeans, and basically imposing completely neoliberal policies that would cause wages to fall so that everybody could be employed, even the people in the ghettos. No European nation is going to accept that. I don't even think Sweden would accept that proposal. Yeah. So that's just a total non-starter. When he talks about the United States, basically he says, look, we have to understand the main thing that's driving right-wing populism is immigration in America and in Europe. We have to deal with this. So what do we do in America? Well, we can't go back to the idea that America was a white society. He says it's our fate to be a multicultural liberal democracy. He just asserts that, right? And he says, therefore, we have to assimilate these people. Well, my question is, there are a lot of questions about assimilation. First of all, assimilate them to what? Burritos and hip-hop and the NFL? There's nothing there. There's an absolute void of a culture to assimilate anybody to. And this culture that we have is entirely lacking in any normative quality. It's entirely a culture of self-gratification. There's nothing about contemporary American culture that would build any form of loyalty to the body politic. So what is he talking about assimilating people to exactly? Beyond that, assimilation of different immigrant groups from Europe was a very difficult thing in American history. There was bloodshed over that. There was great difficulty. It was not an easy thing. Assimilationism today, though, in America is basically the opiate of the boomer conservatives. They take a shot at this idea that somehow, someday, we'll assimilate all these people and it'll be fine and we don't have to think about American identity or returning to an earlier stage of identity or figuring out how to get rid of them all, right? The thing is, though, we're not trying to assimilate them. We haven't tried to assimilate people for more than a generation. We stopped assimilating people when we embraced multiculturalism. You can't be multicultural and assimilationist at the same time. They're a contradiction to one another. And to float the idea of assimilationism is basically to declare yourself to be a racist when you get right down to it. Declare yourself to be a chauvinist. And I don't think that any neocon, Fukuyama or any other, is willing to actually cross that bridge. That is too difficult for them to conceive. If you read this Fukuyama book, he talks about great heroes, and his examples of great heroes are Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and Nelson Mandela. I'm sorry, but a man who thinks that Nelson Mandela, is one of the first three great heroes to come to his lips, is not going to support real assimilationism. And as a matter of fact, we've had Negroes on the North American continent for 400 years now, and they haven't really been assimilated. We tried for a long time, and then we stopped trying. The other thing is that with immigration, they're assimilating us. And the reason why they're assimilating us is because white Americans have totally lost any self-confidence in our culture. But they're very self-confident in their cultures, such as they are, right? Muslims are very, very self-confident about their culture and their outlook, and they think that everybody else should share it. We are not a people that has the backbone and self-confidence to impose impose assimilation on other people. And therefore, it's really just a non-starter. It's not going to happen. And again, he's proposing this for the political establishment to start. This is what our government has to do. This is what the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have to get on board with, and to get the political class on board with, so we can actually create policies to do this. There is no way that that will ever happen. There's just too much opposition to that. It's racism, basically. It's equivalent in most people's minds to the white identity politics that he's trying to ward off. And on some deep level it is. To somehow forge new forms of inclusive, democratic, liberal democratic culture. I don't know what that would be, though, right? And he doesn't give us any indication of what this basically synthetic, fake culture is going to be. He says it's not enough just to have people raise their hand and take an oath that they're going to be Americans. There has to be something more to that. There has to be a culture that we have in common. What sort of culture that will be, again, besides burritos and hip-hop, is entirely empty. It's but the underlying assumption here, and he makes this very explicit. He says the error that the identitarians of the right make is to assume that identity is somehow given to you by your biology or your heredity, when it's really not. We can have all kinds of identities. He basically has to embrace a completely social constructivist notion of identity. Why? Because the thing that's going to save America from our kind of identity politics is for the establishment to construct a fake liberal democratic identity politics. And there's no indication, though, of what the content of that liberal democratic identity politics is going to be. So this is the best that the neocons have come up with so far. And I'm very, very encouraged by that. I got this book and I was reading through it and I was thinking, I had a certain amount of trepidation, you know? I thought, there was a little tremble in my hand as I took it out of the package. Maybe he's going to find some way of squaring the circle. Maybe he's going to blow us out of the water. Maybe there's some argument that I hadn't thought of yet. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. He concedes essential points that we've been arguing, and then he still tries to revert back to liberal democracy as the end of history, and he has no real concrete proposals that will actually save liberal democracy from us. So I'm very encouraged, and I hope they send some more of their heavy hitters to try this out, because the more they come forward and the more they strike out, the more the resolve of the existing establishment is going to weaken. Because I do believe that ideas matter and ideas shape history, and there are lots of people who are going to be looking to people like Fukuyama for an answer because they're troubled. Part of why they're troubled is because they sense that maybe there's nothing wrong with France for the French. How did that ever become a problematic idea, right? How did it ever become problematic that America should be for Americans and France for the French? People are troubled by our ideas, and they're going to people like Fukuyama and Galston and Lilla and others for solace. They want to see some of these intellectuals make their system work. And the more they strike out, the more people in the center, white people in the center, even white people on the left, are going to start saying, we need a new paradigm. We need to embrace identity politics of our own. So thank you.